FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
And we are back at the financialsurvivalnetwork.com. What's going on in the Ukraine? What's going on with the price of gold? Here to talk about it, Alasdair McLeod, head of GoldMoney's research department. Alasdair, welcome back.
That's very much my pleasure, Kerry.
Hey, so this Ukraine situation seems to deteriorate by the moment. It appears that all's quiet on the Eastern Front, but really far from it, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's right. The pace has been controlled by Putin. It's interesting that after he occupied the Ukraine, the message he sent to the West was that that's all he needs to do. That's all he wants to do. He's not going to do anything more. He's going to sort of calm down now. But meanwhile, in the parliament and also on the streets, the message that they have in Moscow is very different. It's a gung-ho message. So I can only conclude that Putin will be satisfied by one final development, and that is that the Ukraine is under his control. Now, whether this is a puppet government or whether it's absorbed into Russia, I think is a secondary issue. He actually wants to have the Ukraine as a buffer between him and NATO, and that is the point.
And historically, the function of the Ukraine has always been as a buffer, but it was a buffer from the mongrel hordes coming from the east to the west, not the NATO hordes coming from the west to the east towards Russia, right?
Well, that's generally true. But I think if you go back to the Second World War, just before the Second World War, of course, Hitler started moving in that direction. And there's quite a strong sort of Germanic influence from, going back in time. And he wanted rather to sort of reclaim that. And then you've got Poland as well, which, has always been trampled over by one force or another. So more recently, I think that the if you like, the post-revolution Russian history has really been having a buffer from those nasty, evil capitalists in the West. And I think that has been, not so much the role of the Ukraine, because the border was actually far more to the west. It incorporated Bulgaria, Hungary, and of course Yugoslavia. So, but Russia has lost quite a lot, I think, post-Glasnost. And the problem with Ukraine is that we've sent our intelligence services in there to destabilize it and try and make it democratic, quote unquote, going all the way back to the Orange Revolution. And of course, the Russians know this. Our politicians will talk about the need for democracy and so on. But actually, the reality is that we have created a situation which has led to the overthrow of governments, now 2 governments in the Ukraine. And of course, I think that Russia is bound to feel that our agenda is really unfriendly.
And so this isn't a spontaneous outpouring of the populace of the Ukraine wanting freedom and democracy. This has been orchestrated, correct?
That's right. First of all, it was orchestrated by us. If we go back to the Orange Revolution, which, goodness me, that must be 10 years ago now.
Yeah, at least 10 years ago.
Of course, Putin, who, is a good chess player. I don't know if he plays chess, but if he doesn't, perhaps he should take it up. He's really got us on the back foot. And he managed to regain control of the Ukraine with not one single casualty on either side. And I think that is the result of a master strategy. You have to admire the way he has done it, if nothing else.
Well, one thing that's going to happen, though, around the world is that this is going to accelerate fracking for natural gas, both in the Ukraine, in the UK, and it's a real blow to the environmental lobby, don't you think?
Yes, it is. I mean, the environmental lobby, I think, is a receding tide. It really replaced, I think, the sort of socialist mantra, which took a very nasty knock in the wake of Glasnost, if we come back to the Russian situation. All those people, all those sort of left-wing people then got on the ecological bandwagon. They are still there, yes, but governments, I think, have seen the folly of going down that route, and now they're trying to back off from this sort of more expensive energy, because in the wake of the banking crisis in 2008, we can't afford to experiment with lovely green things which cost considerably more than the established way of doing things. And I think the other thing is that all the climate change people, they started off by saying global warming. I don't know if you've noticed, Kerry, but instead of global warming, we now have climate change. The reason for that is that the world didn't warm. I mean, it peaked in something like 2000 or 2002. And
not this winter. In the northeast of the States, it sure didn't warm. Tell you that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, but if we sort of just gloss over the regional variations, which can be quite considerable, overall, the world has not warmed the way in which people said it would, in which the way the self-appointed experts said it would.
And their computer models are totally off, especially this winter.
Absolutely. So I think that we're going to see lots more fracking, because it's driven really by the need for energy, cheaper energy than could be produced by tidal machines or windmills or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think there will be these sources of energy, but they're not as cheap as oil coming out of the ground from established oil fields. And that is where Russia has an enormous strength. I mean, she is the largest exporter of energy in the world. And I think that's a very important point.
At the present time, but not for that much longer. But one thing, Mark Stein, the Canadian columnist who now resides in the U.S., likened the climate changers and the green lobby as a form of decadence. And, the thing about decadence is you need a prosperous economy throwing off loads and loads of disposable income to afford to be decadent, Alasdair. And right now, decadence is really a luxury that you can't afford. We can't afford it anymore. And that's why fracking is going to take off in the UK. There's lots of areas where it's ripe for it. And in the Ukraine, there's vast areas where fracking is just going to take off. And I know it's not a short-term fix for Putin's stranglehold on gas. It's more of an intermediate to long-term cure for things. And you're just going to see that take off now. The investments that are going to be made in it are going to be huge. And that's the cure to Putin's stranglehold on natural gas, as well as now in the U.S. looking at large terminals to export liquid petroleum gas to Europe and to Asia.
Yes, indeed. But I think that the benefits for the Ukraine aren't going to even begin until the political situation is stabilized. I can't see anyone putting any serious money into the Ukraine before that happens.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, you got to have that. And, until Putin has something else to occupy his attentions, you're not going to see much stability in that area. And hey, what about the other former Soviet republics that are now pretty much shaking in their boots, like the Baltic republics, like Moldova, if I pronounced it right, and other former republics? They're all kind of sitting up, taking notice of this, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I mean, obviously, the whole region has a huge vested interest in what's going on in the Ukraine. Yes, they are nervous. Some of the Baltic states are now part of NATO, so they're rather glad that they are, I think. Moldavia is an interesting one, because there's a sort of northeast corner of it which actually is very Russian. And the So you've got a sort of Russian pocket, and in extremis, I suppose that Mr. Putin might like to protect his fellow countrymen there, but that he's got to march through the Ukraine in order to do it. Otherwise, Moldavia, I don't know. I mean, I think I would think that's almost a non-story. Places like Romania, I think. Are very happy that they're now in the West, in the EU and part of NATO. So really, this is Russia's problem. The boundary between NATO and Russia has effectively marched east towards her, and Belarus and the Ukraine form the boundary. Belarus, of course, that still remains a typical old Soviet-style dictatorship. And the Ukraine, I think Putin would wish was similar, but that's where the hotspot is now. There's something very interesting, actually, about Mr. Putin and China. If I can switch topics slightly,
sure.
There was an interview conducted by a BBC man called Robert Peston, who's their sort of senior business guy, with Hank Paulson, and he was talking about to Hank Paulson about the time of the Lehman crisis. And of course, Mr. Paulson had to keep the Chinese, if you like, on side as foreign creditors when all this was blowing up. And he was told by the Chinese at one stage that they had been approached by senior Russian sources with a suggestion that Russia and China should get together and sell Fannie and Freddie and destabilize the system. And the Chinese refused to take part. I think that's a very, very important thing, because if we try and attack Russia with financial restrictions, if we get into a financial war, if we intensify that, then Russia isn't entirely toothless. I think it would be wrong to say that China is entirely on Russia's side, but China will not go against Russia. And it could well be that if we get really silly about this, that China finds herself working with Russia to try and stop us being even more silly. That is an interesting thing. I mean, obviously things have changed since the time of the Lehman crisis, and it would no longer be appropriate to destabilize Fannie or Freddie. But given that China has cornered the gold market, I think that is where I would go nuclear, if you like, in a financial sense, if I was Russia and China. And I note that Russia has acquired another, was it 7 or 9 tons or something of gold in this last month. That came up today. So you can see that this situation over the Ukraine, unless we are very wise about it, could escalate into something really rather nasty, and we will be on the losing end.
For sure. And we'll talk more about this up next on the Financial Survival Network. We're speaking with Alasdair McLeod.
FSN Radio.
Urgent alert. Ex-Secret Service agent claims it's worse than people know. One of Obama's former Secret Service agents recently smelled a rat. What he discovered inside our government was so devastating, he only saw one option. He quit. What's worse, he fears what he found could affect your job, your neighborhood, and most importantly, your family, very soon. It's worse than people know, he said in a recent interview, and I'm not trying to scare you either. We too share his concerns. This is why we've devoted the better part of 3 years collecting solutions for nearly all problems created by intrusive governments, and we've succeeded. Go to hiddensecrets1.info to check out all the details. Our panel of insiders have devised a legal but sneaky set of solutions to help you reclaim your privacy from the NSA, opt out of Obamacare, and make a bundle from little-known investments and small business opportunities. Simply visit hiddensecrets1.info. That's Hidden Secrets, the number 1.info.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
We are back on the Financial Survival Network. Alasdair, what's going on here in China? We're hearing things about bank runs. We're hearing about an M3 that has literally jumped the shark. It is out of control. And inflation, of course, in the Western world, we refuse to recognize it. All of the CPI measures say there is no inflation, and yet you go to a supermarket, you go to a restaurant, and it sure looks like there's inflation. What's your take on things?
Well, first of all, about the restaurants, I agree with you entirely. And I don't think it's only in your part of the world. It's everywhere. Going back to China, yes, you're right. The expansion of money supply, which has really been through the expansion of bank credit, has been truly phenomenal. The total bank credit in the Chinese economy now is estimated at about $25 trillion equivalent. That is not quite twice the M3, if they were still calculating it, that you would have in the United States on an economy that is considerably smaller than the United States. So you can see that it's not just the Fed that's really sort of been trying to pump up money supply. It has been pumping up in China to a far greater degree. The difference being that it's bank credit as opposed to raw money. I mean, the Fed's been pumping raw money because banks haven't been expanding credit enough. So to this, you've also got to add the shadow banking, and this is, I think, creating quite a lot of information and disinformation, the whole of the shadow banking story. I don't know what the shadow banking in that country is, but if you told me it was another 10 trillion on top of the 25 trillion, I think I would agree that that's quite likely. So if we're looking at about 35 trillion of real money on balance sheet and off balance sheet, I mean, this is a money bubble of enormous proportions, and it's financed, empty cities, airports with no aircraft, roads with no traffic, bridges to nowhere. I mean, the malinvestments that this is supported is just absolutely incredible. It makes building a pyramid, the pharaohs building a pyramid, taking everybody off the land to take 20 years to build a pyramid. I mean, it makes that look like child's play in terms of economic distortion. This is quite spectacular.
The U.S. Congress must be so jealous because they're pikers compared to the malinvestment taking place in China. I mean, we just have a few bridges to nowhere in Alaska. We've got studies of why college students drink beer and why they have sex. I mean, we're nothing compared to the Chinese. I don't think the Chinese waste their money on those. Well, they must be curious. They've got to be curious, right, Alasdair?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, aren't you dying to know why college students drink beer? I know. I stay up late at night thinking about it.
Yeah. I might join them too. Do a bit of
do your own research.
No, but I mean, China, the expansion of money in China has just been phenomenal, and of course, money bubbles are the root of asset bubbles. And in China, it hasn't been in the stock market, but it's been in property. And that's now beginning to fall. We get reports that property prices in Hong Kong, for example, are now falling quite rapidly because the Chinese aren't buying there anymore. I don't think there's any reliable indicator in terms of property prices on the mainland. But if that bubble is coming to an end, and you're seeing various businesses go bankrupt. You saw a run on a small bank. All this gets reported. These are all, I think, indicative of the money bubble coming to some sort of end. Of course, every central bank believes that it can manage the process of climbing down from the high. But I don't think anyone's actually managed to achieve that yet.
Yeah, every college student believes that they can manage the amount of beer they can consume, and that they can manage the hangover the next morning too. And until they hit their 20s, it usually doesn't work out too well either, Alasdair. Right?
Yeah, it took me longer than that to learn that lesson.
Yeah, I was kind of in my late 30s till I finally realized that save it for the weekends. It doesn't really work out too well. Yeah. And unfortunately, China's going to learn that lesson. And you know what the real problem is? There's no deposit insurance in the country because, like you mentioned before our call, is that they have no deposit insurance, and the country's banking system is effectively nationalized, no transparency. Basically, it's not the strength of your financial statements, it's who you know that determines whether you get the loan. So it's not too hard to envision that the banking system is effectively insolvent. And they don't really have any experience with markets going down and actually losing money, the Chinese public. And I'm predicting that they're going to be passing out EBT cards, as we call them here in the States, otherwise known as food stamp cards, once the losses become massive, because the government cannot take mass starvation and the potential for mass rioting. And if this thing gets out of control and you have mass deflation in the form of all that money that you were referring to, Alasdair, getting destroyed in this bubble, what choice are they going to have? They can't allow a large portion of this this newly urbanized public to not eat. That's a recipe for insurrection.
Well, yes. I think, however, that this is likely to play out rather differently from what we would expect in the West. I mean, in the West, the banks are generally not owned by the government. Some of them still are as a result of the Lehman crisis. But anyway, we'll gloss over that. If a bank in the West goes bust, then deposit insurance, as you rightly said, that kicks in. If the bank goes bust, it could be that the government decide to rescue the bank. It could be that there's a bail-in, which is the new fashion to try and take the burden off taxpayers and put it on the large depositors. So it is if you like, it's effectively a private sector catastrophe with a state safety net behind it. In China, it's very, very different. The banks are fundamentally owned by the government, either local government or central government. And as a result, instead of banks going bust, I think what we would see the catastrophe hitting the currency. Maybe not immediately, but maybe down the line. So I think it's likely to turn out, if you like, with rather different dynamics from the same situation that we would see in the West. Inevitably, if the currency starts going down substantially, then you're going to have the problem of price inflation. And I think that's where the problems are likely to arise, if you like, amongst the population. You know, the cost of rice and all this sort of stuff, that goes up. I mean, this gets very, very fundamental as far as they're concerned.
Well,
but against that, the Chinese are enormous savers. I mean, they put aside something like, where they're gainfully employed as opposed to working the land, they put aside something like 40% of their income. I mean, it's quite staggering the level at which they save. So they believe, if you like, that this is all flash in the pan. I'm being a wise Chinaman now, living in in some sort of town somewhere in China. It's all a flash in the pan, but I've got my savings. So one way or the other,
bank.
I've got either in the bank. Or I've got property in this new city or whatever. Okay, it's empty, but that's not the point. I've got somewhere, I've got somewhere to live. I've got money in the bank. I've got some gold. The only thing I haven't got, thank goodness, is stocks on the stock market. Which
they've got that too. That's gone down 80% or 60%.
Yeah, but it's been falling for a very, very long time. So that's not really part that hasn't reflected the money bubble in the way that property has. So I think that there is a feeling, if you like, amongst the Chinese people that they are secure in the sense that they have saved up against this rainy day. Meanwhile, they're partying like mad. I mean, that is only now just beginning to come to an end. The government is determined to clamp down on these excesses, and that's what we're seeing.
Well, I wish them the best of luck, because they're going to need it, because you can't prepare for the inevitable. That's one thing that we in the West should have learned long ago. So, Alasdair, we find your work where?
Well, as you said at the introduction, I write for GoldMoney, which is goldmoney.com. I head up the research effort there. I also have my own website, which really repeats pretty well what goes on the GoldMoney site, and that's financeandeconomics.org, financeandeconomics, one word, .org. And if there's something which isn't suitable for GoldMoney, then I might publish it on that, but that happens quite unusually, if you like. And so, no, that's where you'll find me.
All right. And of course, link to GoldMoney's research efforts will be found in the show notes on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Don't forget, sign up for the newsletter. It's going out today, I promise. I've put the final touches on it. So financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Thanks so much for being on with us again, Alasdair. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for asking me, Kerry.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.